I want to track an inner dialogue, a moment in time that I think is significant. And so I want to zoom in and blow it up for myself and anyone else watching. So physiologically today, I am somewhat dissociative. That ties in a little bit with some changing in sleep patterns, ties in a little bit with, so I only slept 4 hours, then a dream woke me up. I normally sleep 8 hours. I went out, did some meditation, felt great, decided to microdose some mushroom, so less than a gram. And with one of the things that I'm kind of tracking a little bit at the moment is with PTSD, I've got what I understand to be a fairly high dose of endogenous opioids going on to facilitate the traumatic dissociation, at levels of grief and pain that I'm still kind of finding my way to deal with. And so one of the things is that's a big number, a big freezer, and then the mushroom is kind of transcending that, and so it takes it's two phenomena going on at one time, and ideally working with the trauma cathartically and releasing that, and then releasing the endogenous opium kind of defense mechanism, I think would be ideal, but it's a terrifying prospect. And there's a protocol called PSIP with psychedelic somatics, but because it's such a terrifying prospect, I'm much more nitpicky about the therapists, and so I found myself not feeling good about the ethics of the therapist in the email. There was a little bit too much self-centeredness about how to do it in the best way for the therapist, which I think is wrong, right? You don't ask someone with a broken leg to hobble over to the doctor because the doctor with 2 good legs doesn't want to move, right? That's an ethical, value. And so I didn't like that, and so that kind of terminated that pathway. So. But I think microdosing, which doesn't interfere too much with that dissociative, endogenous opioid numbing, is and can be beneficial. For example, in that heavily sedated opioid state, I rarely remember dreams. It's somewhat hard to think clearly and get out of bed. I'm kind of submerged underwater to a certain extent, and have been for some years. So I kind of, with a microdose, it was just enough that there was a little bit of activity going, and just slight, if my eyes were closed, I could slightly see some geometric shapes, whereas often when I microdose, it's kind of subvisual. But I was very tired, and so I found myself sleeping and dreaming. And I realized, most of what I was seeing was kind of, quote, a bad trip, meaning there wasn't a lot of enlightenment in these images. And so my protocol was just to breathe, be present, and let go. And if I needed to interrupt anything, just open my eyes, because it was a very background thing that just was coming more into the foreground as I was half asleep. And so that was one of the first times I've kind of microdosed half asleep and when tired. So I just noticed that. But I did have a dream courtesy of a much lighter microdose the night before, that was an insightful dream. It was actually a dream of the distinction between talking and presence, which kind of comes to bear in something like this, because my general idea about the ideal communication is that the speaker communicates what they are doing and why they are doing it and how they came to that why, so that the listener can be brought into the world of the speaker rather than into their projected world. Because in the absence of that data, what you're doing it, why you're doing it, and how you arrived at that why based on various experiences, anything that isn't said around that is filled, the void is filled with projection. So, for example, if I don't describe why I'm making this video, so we could actually do a little sub thing, and this would be consistent with that idea, right? That you need to know why and how and this. So I'm making this video for you. I grasped it enough, just reflecting on it, that I don't need this video, so I'm making this video for you. The subject, it seems like I'm at a choice point that many people are always at to some degree, and that has a very big impact on the future. And so bringing awareness to such choice points generally leads to better choices. So that's what I'm doing for you, is bringing awareness to this choice point so that you can make better choices. And possibly I'll make a slightly better choice because it's different to spend 20 minutes describing something than just to think about it in a few seconds. So that's why I'm making this video. And then the way that I'm going about making this video, the level of detail, comes from literally hundreds of experiences where I've been aware that the listener to me was making up erroneous stories about what I was doing and why I was doing it and how I had come about to that conclusion, and that none of that was being talked about. And so when I explored in a few times and said, well, okay, why do you think I'm doing this? They would always say something different than the reason I knew I was doing it. And then when I thought about, what do you think this means that I'm doing that? And then they would come up with another erroneous reason. I basically realized that everyone that I was speaking to, and maybe there's a 1% divergence, I can't tell, but everyone that I was speaking to was making up a story about what I was doing and why I was doing it that was often 180 degrees from actually what I was doing and why I was doing it and how I had come to that. Number one. Number two, it didn't occur to them that they were making up a story. And number three, the story was separating us because they believed their story. And four, they had no protocol, no humility to interject and question their story. And as a result of that arrogance, meaning just the unquestioned assumption that their assumption was correct, they were moving too fast through the terrain, and as a result, there was no time for me to interject. So I actually had to work fairly hard to break other people's flow. Say, hey, I realize you think you know exactly what's going on, and I realize you think that your story is infallible, but I'd like to interject some data in here. And I would begin by asking them what they thought was going on. And they've never got it right. So this has led to like a big aha moment. Nobody is listening to other people. They're listening to their stories, based on their false projections about other people, which are occasionally right if people are normal. But they're never listening to the person. They're listening to the story, which is occasionally right if the people are normal. Meaning if the people are brainwashed into doing things the way the cult says to do things, for the reasons the cult says to do things, in the way that the cult says to do things, if they're doing all that because they're brainwashed, and the one is brainwashed into the story and the other is brainwashed into the thought process and the doing, then the story is going to be right because the cult has brainwashed both parties. But if you have anyone actually thinking, anyone actually awake doing something because they've thought about it, then the brainwashed story about why people are doing what they're doing no longer fits. And it never fit the person, it fit the brainwashing. So to me, this is an enormous distinction between actually dealing with real people and dealing with endless layers of projection that create disconnect between real people. So having decided that that's a really big issue, and having decided that I don't like being in relationships where people are constantly projecting what I'm doing and then projecting why I'm doing it, and then projecting my reactions to their response to their 2 layers of misinformation with another projection, and not pausing that, to me, that's insane, right? I'm not actually having any relationship with anyone. I'm just relating to these projections, and I don't like it. And so then the question is what to do about it. Well, the answer is to say, here's what I'm doing, and here's why I'm doing it. And these are the experiences that led up to that, and this is my analysis. Now, if you're willing to patiently go along that thread, rather than just jump into your story, then you have a chance each step of the way to see where we diverge and converge. You have the chance to say, well, why did you decide to do that instead of this based on that value? And then why did you decide to do it this way instead of this way based on the same value? Because based on the same value, in my experience, you could have taken a turn right here with this thought, this belief, and that action. And then you would have felt this, and statistically, it would have produced more of this outcome that you apparently want. That's the kind of conversation I'm interested in having. It's just not the conversation that seems to be on the menu. People generally blank out, lose the complexity of the mental architecture, and just, the term too much information, TMI, is considered valid and popular. But it just means I don't want to think about all the things that you're actually thinking about because I don't care enough about you or those thoughts to fully understand them. I'd rather just, have the 2, projection dialogues going on where nobody's actually understanding and seeing each other, and nobody's talking about that, and nobody's talking about how that impacts the culture and the individuals in it. So that's why I'm doing all this. But in my dream, I was talking with Elon Musk and trying to explain how I'd gotten to the interaction, and he started running away. And so, it led to a question, since I really enjoy Elon, and if I did encounter him, would like to have a constructive, contribute something rather than, overwhelm him. But it left me with kind of an equation, like if Elon runs away to avoid all of these kind of nuanced things, do I need to change my technique, right? Because the technique is a response to mass invisibility, and this is the best technique to hack through that. Only it's primarily a technique that creates isolation and overwhelm in a different area. The audience, the listener, is usually wants to interrupt after 30 seconds to a minute, and I've got 15 minutes more of the thread to go through before the architecture is laid out, so that we could have a conversation about what actually went on in my mind, in the culture, etc. But they're not holding a 15-minute image. They're holding a piece of a 1-minute image, and then they're losing, and so there's a disconnect there, right? And the question is there anything I can do about that? Because I can hold a 1-hour image in my mind. If you talk to me for 1 hour, I can hold a 1-hour image. And I can hold my own 1-hour image if I talk, right? And a 1-hour image is more intricate, more complex, more dimensional than a 1-minute image. And so it's more valuable in my eyes in areas that are important. Cultural design is the most important area that I've identified on the planet. So we're dealing with cultural design. That's what we're talking about in the peripheral here. A culture of projection versus a culture of what, where, why, how, when, that's actually connecting to people, right? So this is a big conversation in my eyes, because I've identified cultural design as the single biggest impact on our planet's future, is the design of the culture. And the cult is built out of largely unconscious memes, and so this is an iteration of a dysfunctional and largely unconscious meme. So that's all kind of a little bit of, an aside. So, I'm somewhat becoming aware of the amount of shame that I feel, the amount of humiliation, the amount of shame, the amount of pain, the amount of disappointment, the amount of fear I have about that pain, shame, and disappointment when it comes to entering these terrains, because they are largely dishonored, largely attacked, when I consider it to be, the most brilliant work of my life and the most important work that anyone can do on the planet. Meaning, when you consider that there's 400 million people unconsciously copying a template, if you can improve the template by 300%, and it takes you 6 hours to go through the mock-up, and anyone going through that 6-hour protocol and design would then come out the other side with a 300% more competent template, and then that meme spreads, that's going to change the future of, for example, the United States more than any other thing, changing cult memes, which means you've got to look at the efficacy of the current meme. You've got to look at the probability field of pleasure and suffering and energy, and then you've got to look at something 10 times more effective. Then you've got to figure out how to get to that 10 times more effective meme. And then you got to find a way to infect more people with the new meme, right? And that's the most important engineering on the planet, as far as I'm concerned. I'll happily take an emotionally literate, relationally literate, traumatically literate population in horse and buggies over the latest Tesla and speed rail in traumatic dissociation. I think there'd be more happiness, more well-being, going slower in horse and buggies than I think there is going fast with the level of psychological illiteracy that pervades the cult. But that is not celebrated around me in the cult. The only thing that's being measured is this taking too long or not? That's it. And the answer is 95% or 90% of the time, people just say that I'm taking too long to do what I consider to be, the most important work on the planet. I mean, I've done the analysis, spent many hours doing it. I can't think of a more significant impact on the planet's future, including the species, of course, that's part of the planet, it depends on the planet, as the science of cultural design. So it's incredibly heartbreaking to have no role models, no templates, no paths laid out there for how to be an effective cultural designer and be honored for that. So that's an entire wall of just thousands of moments of dishonor that feel heartbreaking to me. But that's built on a 5- and 6-year-old being hit, being shouted at, being treated unfairly, being bullied, etc., by parents, by teachers, humiliated, etc. That also has a tremendous amount of shame because, the sociopathic level of horror induced in a young body, the nightmares, the complex PTSD, is again completely buried under 9 levels of lies. Lies about lies about lies about lies about lies. And then we're supposed to base and understand the current moment on the top of all those lies. There's no place to examine them. There's tremendous grief and frustration around this. So I carry a lot of that shame in my body. It's a pain that in many ways I'm afraid of, that I don't know how to feel in its intensity without it spiraling. And by spiraling, meaning I know how to go into this unimaginable pain, loneliness, and grief. But I do not know how to go into it and love and honor myself while in it, which puts me in a dependent relationship on the cult. And I do not know how to find a therapist who is able and willing to respond with the warmth and love that is necessary for me not to feel shamed in the abandonment of that level of pain and grief by the world around me, which is so painful that it can quickly turn down into hate, into rage, into hostility, with the amount of hurt of being in that amount of pain around numb and dissociated and incompetent people that cannot respond empathically because they cannot grasp the wound, because there's too many lies, right? So this is, in many ways, the most important subject of my life. It is an identity-defining terrain filled with grief and pain. So I'm listening to a podcast about, I'm working on an app for my landscape business, and, there is the possibility, perhaps even a probability, that this, could really touch the lives of a lot of people and become part of something incredible. But I'm more afraid of this pain than I am in love with the app. I would way rather avoid shame and humiliation than I would, avoid failure around this app. And so this angel investor is talking about one of the things that he's looking at in a founder, whether to invest or not. And, he's saying that, one of the traits which I have is incredibly deep listening. But another of the traits is complete confidence in future growth. He doesn't want to invest in anyone who's saying, well, if it works out, then this will happen and this happen. He wants someone who has complete confidence in the vision and the expansion. And I don't have that because I'm afraid of the shame. I'm afraid of facing the shame. I'm afraid of facing the trauma. I'm afraid of the symptoms, the sensations in my body that feel overwhelming and dissociative. And I'm afraid of being all alone in those setups with people pressuring me because they want money from me, because they want growth from me. And I just want a sane, empathic human being who sees me and is there with me, and I can't find it in a reptilian environment, in a sociopathic environment. And I feel enormous grief and also some shame, right, that I wouldn't measure up in that type of a situation. And so I see all that, and then I need to decide what to do. One path is to self-sabotage and avoid the terrain. That's worked very well for me. And just keep within a domain that I can control. Another area, that I go into is arrogance and hostility, turning this hurt and this humiliation and flipping it to being superior to other people and using my articulating talent to basically, suggest that you're stupid and dumb, rather than that I'm not good enough, right? And so that's another thing that it deflects some of the shame, but it still leads to disconnect. The sabotage works very well, but it also leads to a certain hurt and frustration that so many of my dreams are not blossoming because they'd take me into these terrains. Then I look at the PSIP protocol and therapy and, whether or not to take the risk there. But the question of whether to believe in beauty, truth, and goodness in the ideal, or whether to believe in the pain and the wound and try to avoid it, I think is a very vulnerable and poignant terrain that we all need to navigate at some point or another. Because in a cult that violates the archetypal whole and integrated self, the sense that we come in with, and then it's chopped and butchered and shamed and squeezed into a box. In a cult that doesn't honor its wounding protocol, it doesn't acknowledge that it's doing that, every child feels shame, unworthy, unlovable, and unseen, and dishonored, because they are, and because the grown-ups are not acknowledging their inadequacy, right, and not apologizing for the wound. And so it's kept there, and the question is what to do about it, and how much life is killed, how much hope, how much excitement is killed. Just not to be in that terrain. And people tend to treat us the way that we believe and treat ourselves. And so if I'm more afraid of being hit and more afraid of being a disappointment, I'm not going to believe and represent myself as definitely it's going to work. I'm going to say, this is what makes me feel great and protected in this terrain, is there's a 90% chance that I will fail, but the upside is worth that risk. If someone will invest or buy in or support based on those actual statistics, then, how can they beat me for not getting in the 10%? when 9 out of 10 fail, right? Yeah, and I just feel also just very tired, right? Very hesitant. I feel sore, sunburned, like gingerly. I want to sit and move around. I want to do things gingerly to avoid and escape pain. So this is a junction point, how to respond to all of this. And there's no playbook that I know of, but it will have a very big impact on my future, as it will on yours in the similar terrain that you discover or find in yourself.